So today we're going to be talking about chapter 17, section 1, and it's just titled Italy and the Birth of the Renaissance. And the word Renaissance means rebirth. And once more, it's not that there was no literature. We just see a rebirth in the amount of creative works that were coming out of this time period. So when I'm talking about Europe in the era of the Renaissance, around 1500, notice that when we look at the map, we're beginning to see countries that you might recognize, like France or Spain, England or Ireland. But notice that a lot's changed since then. For example, there was no Germany.
There's Russia.
Well, I mean, there's Lithuania.
That's all we know.
There's the Rus, a people group. I mean, obviously, the people who are Russian today lived there. Just for the most part, they were still being ruled by the Mongols. And so, Lithuania would be an exception. There's just many different places that have changed a lot, but we're starting to see some countries that you might recognize. So the Renaissance is just this term that historians use to talk about an era where we really start to see a ton of cool art and music and culture that's obviously had an influence on today's world. And so eras like this don't fit into a nice little box, but in terms of a timeline, we're talking about roughly 1300-ish, roughly 1600-ish. Meanwhile, the Crusades actually had an influence on starting the Renaissance in the sense that while the Crusades were ultimately a failure, it opened up Western Europe to other cultures and other ways of thinking. So, for example, I have a veteran in my night class, and we were learning about Islam last night. And as I was talking about Muslim culture, he got to recount his experiences while being stationed in Iraq. Well, I mean, that's Blue Ridge for you. You'll have adults sometimes in your classes. He's about my age, so he had served in the Iraq War, and while he was stationed there, he was just talking about how neat the culture was. So, me? Yeah, I'll be, mid-90s soon enough. So, I'm almost 40. Yeah.
39.
I'm 39. So, anyway, the Crusades again were strategically a defeat for Catholic Western Europe, but more importantly, again, it opened up and opened up, I guess, different parts of the world and connecting different cultures and ideas. Meanwhile, the bubonic plague actually had an influence in the Renaissance. And it's strange to think of it this way, but that, in some places the Renaissance or the bubonic plague killed at least a third, if not 2/3 of the people in Europe. But then what that does is actually give opportunities for those who survived. It created a labor shortage, just like what we're experiencing now, which empowers the common person. So, in terms of thinking of a positive out of such a dark event like the bubonic plague. But where are we really beginning to see the most artwork the soonest? And that's why I zoomed in here on Italy, because this is where a lot of this stuff is coming out. Now, why Italy? Well, first off, a lot of the wealthy business people, when we talk about kind of the rise of commercialism, the beginnings of capitalism, fewer people are making everything they need to survive and bartering for goods they don't have, and more people are earning money and using said money to buy things instead of making them. But the wealthiest business people were really coming out of Italy, and particularly a family called the Medici. And the Medici were so wealthy and powerful, they effectively ran parts of Italy. So they were the banks, they were the businesses, and let's be honest, they were the government. So they controlled most of southern Italy and really all of Florence. But when we're going to begin looking at some works of art in just a moment, and while I'm not an art critic or historian, I'll just kind of begin to help you point out some influences here. But the main general influence is you're going to see a lot of artists and writers looking back to Greece and Rome. And that's just really a medieval philosophy that times past were better than times present. And it's a common idea that you'll see in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and you'll even hear some people say it today, looking back to the golden years or the glory days. So this first one's called The Merchant of Venice. And, you see a lot of influence of Greece and Rome, but also it just gets a glimpse of how artists were drawing at the time. Notice the use of perspective, and that faraway buildings are smaller, so they appear further away. But notice also the artist's use of realism, in that we're looking at what resembles real people. Meanwhile, into writing. A popular intellectual movement that was really taking the continent by storm is this idea of humanism. So medieval philosophy was all about life is terrible, and it's probably not going to get any better, but the afterlife will be better. And so you have to live your life here in such a way that you'll get to go to the afterlife and it will be better. For example, in Catholic doctrine, it was believed that if you were a peasant and your life was really hard, but if you were a faithful Catholic and you did good things and you maintained your faith throughout your life, you could go to the afterlife and live a life of luxury and comfort. And so for the medieval peasant, who is only going to farm ever and will likely die at an early age from any of the number of things we talked about, that gave hope. But now suicide was forbidden in Catholicism. So people who committed suicide in Catholic doctrine, particularly in the Middle Ages, I don't know about today, are considered apostate and go to hell. So it's I don't know exactly. I guess from their perspective, that's considered murder of self. So anyway, yeah. But now humanism is very different. It's an emphasis on life here. And instead of looking to what's next, how can we improve our lives here? And how can we make our world better? And so really it's why social studies and English are part of an academic field called the humanities, are back to this concept, because humanism is about improving our quality of life. It's not about teaching you how to do a thing, unless that's thinking, critical thinking. It's more of just giving you a perspective, which will hopefully make your life a little better. And so that's one of the purposes of reading and writing and music and culture and meeting people from all over the world, is it just enriches our own life. So not only was this humanist philosophy focused on the here and now, and again focused on how can we improve our lives, it's really a secular way of thinking, because regardless of the religion, religion often focuses on what's next, and even Buddhism, which is a philosophy more so than a religion, is still focused on the concept of nirvana. But humanism, again, is focused on, well, how can I make my life better? What can I do? And so, there's different branches of this. There's Greek philosophy called Epicureanism, and it's just based on a Greek philosopher called Epicurus, and his probably most famous statement was, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you shall die." So his concept was what you might call hedonism, is just living for the moment because you don't know what the next moment's going to be. So that's just one of the underlying philosophies we see here in a lot of these Renaissance works. And another important point to make is we have books and we have paintings and we have so much music from this time period, but we have all those things because those people were able to focus their careers on doing just that, meaning that someone was supporting them financially.
So like, someone can do Van Gogh and Picasso.
Right, right. Like a lot of those, that's okay. A lot of those famous authors and painters and composers actually received an income from wealthy families like the Medici. They don't have Spotify back then, and they're not releasing albums, and they're not selling tickets to concerts. So you got to think about, how are these people making a living?
So didn't they have like a form of concerts back then? It was just more.
They did, but I mean, with limits to travel, I mean, there's only so many people you could perform in front of. So honestly, a lot of these musicians and artists and thinkers and writers were able to do those things because they had sponsors. They had patrons who would pay for their lifestyle so that they could focus on making these cool things. Yeah, exactly. That's where the word Patreon comes from, is the word patron, meaning to support. So another philosophy that's important, which also comes to explain why you have to take so many different types of classes as a student, is the concept of a Renaissance person. A Renaissance person is someone who is not just good at one thing, but who actually has a diversity of experiences and talents. So, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, you may know him best as a painter, but he was also quite the inventor, quite the scientist, really. Yeah, and so he developed the first concept for a helicopter, for a submarine. He really did a lot of work on the human anatomy because he was obsessed with this concept of perfection. And so if you're ever curious, what was the Renaissance ideal of beauty, Googling some of Leonardo da Vinci's concepts would be helpful there. Yes, sir.
But didn't Chun-Mu in Korea invent the submarine first?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of invention, like a usable product, but Da Vinci just had a concept for it. Like a concept in that it wouldn't actually, I mean, people have replicated his designs, they're just not functional. So like, for example, his idea for a helicopter was, I don't even know how to describe it, it's this weird spirally thing. And his belief was that, you spin weird spirally thing on top of a platform and it's going to lift off. So, yeah, kind of like the helicopter seeds for maple trees. But, yeah, but now it doesn't work. But it gets to the idea of propulsion, of utilizing the wind to create lift. And so again, his ideas were concepts, but that's an important part of the development process. For example, take any video game you love, and so I'm playing Elden Ring right now. So if I type in Elden Ring concept art, then I'm going to get all these like super wackadoo ideas, because that's how the creative process works. They're probably going to have like some like dandelion walking around, riding a unicycle, and that's just some of their concept art. What's concept art mean? It's just an idea. But some of his ideas were brilliant. So anyway, Da Vinci would have been the ideal Renaissance man because he was good and experienced at a lot of different things. There were even how-to books. I had to read the Courtier in college, and it's a book for how to be wealthy, influential, and popular. And it's really strange how when you read it, even though it's designed for the Renaissance era, it reads as a book like how to have lots of friends and influence others. So it's a how-to book. Self-help books weren't uncommon. And the book was designed to teach someone how to be this Renaissance person. And again, when I say person, I mean men and women, because there were ideals, there were these cultural norms, particularly in the upper class. For example, there were some differences for women. We're not talking about an egalitarian society. So, for example, one of the ideals of womanhood in the Renaissance was to inspire art, but not to create it. But that's not to say that there were no female artists, because we'll look at some in just a little while. It's not to say there were no female composers. It's just uncommon. Yes?
Is that kind of like what happened in the Hunger Games? Is that why like the people that live in the capital look so strange?
I mean,
Like,
you...
their clothing
Yeah, you could argue that that really, a lot of the culture in the Renaissance was about challenging norms, and a lot of the clothing in the Hunger Games is about challenging norms. So, like for example, if you look at like avant-garde fashion today, what that really means is, you'll find some famous people wearing some things that you're like, what are they doing? But what they're trying to do is to create a trend by doing something way out there. Yes, ma'am.
Are we still in the Renaissance? Or when would that?
Yeah, so it doesn't fit into a neat timeline, but let's say 1300 to 1500 would be a good ballpark. Okay. So I just thought this one was neat, so I wanted to show it to you. And so since we were talking about the ideal of womanhood in the Renaissance, this lady might have been seen as the ideal woman.
Why does she look so sad? Or what's wrong with the baby's face?
Yeah. So a few features here that I wanted to point out. So she's wearing probably a corset, something that constricts your torso to create an hourglass figure. And this is why, if you ever watch old-timey movies, it's not uncommon for a woman to faint when they see something scary. And that's because if you're wearing a corset, it constricts your rib cage, meaning that your lung capacity is diminished. And so if you see the scary monster and you're wearing a corset, then you could literally lose your breath and pass out. So it's all about creating this ideal shape. Notice also that her body is almost entirely covered. Modesty was one of these ideals. And notice also that her skin was very pale, because pale skin meant that you didn't have to work outside. And so it was seen as a sign of a life of
So
luxury.
would I have to work outside?
I mean, I work outside all the time, so I wouldn't have, yeah.
Mr. Witt,
Hey.
can we put a corset
No.
Yes.
You can simulate this, though, by just doing this and then take a deep breath. Be careful, though, because these floating ribs at the bottom can actually break. So just, yeah.
Let's do
Yeah,
it.
right. Okay,
We're gonna need
so
it
moving
for my
on.
next project.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so artistic style. We already looked at the concept of realism, and I talked a little about how perspective works in art, and how, for example, my Don Quixote painting over there, the little weird squiggly things at the bottom, those are windmills. And so that's a famous Renaissance work of literature, the book Don Quixote, and it's about a man who suffered from mental illness and traveled the country with his best friend and sidekick. What was his name? Sanchez, I think. Yeah. So anyway, but he believed that he could be a knight in the tradition of the old Middle Ages, and that he could fight monsters, and that he could, save people, and he could be this great hero. But the Renaissance was an era that people considered themselves modern. And so, the fun part of Don Quixote is there were no monsters for him to slay. And so this is a famous painting called The Tilting at Windmills, because he, again, a little disturbed, thought the windmills were monsters. And so he gets on his horse, and he's got his lance, and he's got his armor on, and he goes charging at the windmill. Yeah. Well, there are other stories, but that's one of the more famous ones. So anyway, realism in art, though that's a Picasso, and that's a whole different style of art. So Don Quixote de la Mancha was written in the Renaissance. Picasso drew that, which is a form of abstract. No, that's just a copy. Yeah. No, the real one's the real one's priceless. It's in a museum somewhere. So anyway, realism in painting. We've looked at that, realistic portraits. But also one of the more famous works, and again, many Renaissance painters were just obsessed with this idea of beauty. And how could, Da Vinci wanted to quantify it. He wanted to get it down to there must be certain measurements between the nose and the ears. And if these are perfectly symmetrical according to these measurements, then someone is beautiful. And he believed he could quantify beauty. Now, perhaps the artist that hit it on the mark most closely would have been the artist Donatello, who made the famous statue David. And if you ever look it up, for one, it's a nude statue, so probably not at school would be the best place. But David was designed to be this perfectly symmetrical, beautiful person, and it's considered one of the most beautiful sculptures ever created. It was a male, yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about. I was gonna ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, it probably wouldn't be inappropriate to look it up, but just again, be mindful it's a nude. So,
You could look up whatever it's called and then clean after.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe they put a leaf there or something. But anyway, so realism in painting. This is a great painting that shows both realism and perspective. So you see the people are drawn to be as is, but then you see the river and this use of perspective. It looks three-dimensional, so it's really cool. Now, speaking of Leonardo da Vinci, again, you probably know him best for his famous work, the Mona Lisa. And maybe you also know his famous work, The Last Supper, talking about the Last Supper of Christ, where he met with his disciples one more time before he was crucified. So Da Vinci, again, was just obsessed with this concept of beauty and perfection. But it's also worth noting, in addition to being a painter, he's also famous for many sculptures, but inventing many things, and his works in science. So again, if you look up Da Vinci's anatomy, you can start to, if you want to like depress yourself and play with a ruler, you could look up to see if you fit his perfect measurements. Yeah.
Is he the one that made like that man that's standing in the circle?
Yeah, like from Grey's the book Grey's Anatomy. Yeah, that's a Da Vinci painting, I believe. Is the circle with all the lines around it? That's meant to get these, like, again, quantifying beauty. Yes, ma'am.
Did he write in his notebook like a mirror?
That's a good question.
Because we did a project when I was in 7th grade. We had to write Da Vinci.
You had to write
his notebook in a
backwards.
mirror so I could translate what he wrote.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So with like the closest sculpture to like the most perfect thing, or
Or
whatever,
she's like,
why would you draw it and like sculpt it in the nude? Like why do people do that?
I don't know. Again, maybe it's just obsessed with realism and beauty for what it is. But you're right. Like a lot of sculptures do that, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. Now, an easy way to remember your Renaissance painters are if you're a Ninja Turtles fan. There's Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So Raphael was most famous for his painting of the School of Athens. Another great work that shows perspective, but also, again, this is one of the greatest painters, greatest works, and it's about the Greeks. So it just shows this just Renaissance obsession with Greek and Roman culture. Yes, ma'am?
I thought it was Raphael, not Raphael.
Well, sorry, the Ninja Turtles pronunciation is Raphael, but you're right that in Italian you would say Raphael. So you're right. Sorry, I grew up with the Ninja Turtles, so I can't help it. But so now you guys were asking about female painters. And while it's uncommon, because again, this cultural norm of women inspiring beauty but not creating it, there were great female writers and painters. And so one of the most famous, and I'm going to do my best with the pronunciation of her name, Sofonisba Aguisola. Some of my Spanish speakers could probably help me with this. Italian and Spanish share some characteristics, so anybody want to try?
What?
Much better than me, yes. Okay, so she was one of the most famous female artists of the Renaissance, and then there's a second one too. I mean, there are many, but these are two of the most famous. Now, in terms of writing, which is something I probably have more experience with, one of the coolest trends in the Renaissance was that writers weren't just writing in Greek or Latin, that they were beginning to use the common tongue. And the common tongue Could be Italian, could be English, could be German, but it's a language that everyone speaks, and the word for that is vernacular. So when writers are using the vernacular, they're writing in a way that the reader could understand. But most writers in the Middle Ages were writing in Latin because it was believed that, again, Mass must be performed in Latin, that to read the Bible it must be written in Latin. But as writers began to write in the common tongue, it became more accessible. So I wanted to talk about just a few works of literature that were more famous. The Decameron is a series of works, kind of just popular fictional stories. But one of my favorites, and I have a copy of this if you ever want to borrow it, is from an Italian writer named Niccolo Machiavelli. And he wrote a book called The Prince. It's a pretty short book. It's rather entertaining for something that was written hundreds of years ago. But it was a political guidebook, a how-to for powerful people. And it was a book of, and again, it could read as a book of how to become popular, but it's a diabolical scheme. Because Machiavelli believed that real political power wasn't about morality. It was just about gaining power and keeping power by any means necessary. For example, the Prince, to quote it, he once said that it is good for a ruler to be loved. It is more important for them to be feared. And it is, a ruler must try to do good, but be prepared to do evil when necessary. So, Machiavellianism, it's a thing, is a term to refer to what Nixon called realpolitik, is looking at the world not in terms of right and wrong. And this is really what Thucydides was getting at with your first essay in the Melian dialogue, because the Melians were saying, no, don't hurt us, it's not right. And of course the Athenians responded with, might makes right. That foreign policy is not about morality, it's about power. And Machiavelli argued that the people who understand this, that are real about it, will be more successful. So anyway, that's all I have time for now.